What if the person you married, the one you trusted most, was the reason your whole family fell apart? What if your final words weren't just about love, but blame? And what if the man the world once knew as a brilliant director, a doting father, and a tireless advocate, died believing his wife helped destroy everything he'd built? This isn't fiction. This is Rob Reiner's final truth. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And it begins with a scream. December 14th, Brentwood, California. A luxury estate tucked behind hedges and silence. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, $13.5 million worth of serenity, tucked away from the chaos of Hollywood and the chaos within. But that Sunday, everything broke. By nightfall, both Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70, were dead. Found stabbed to death inside their sprawling mansion. Multiple sharp force injuries. That's how the coroner's report would later phrase it. Cold. Clinical. But the reality? It was brutal. It was personal. And it was inside their home. Even worse, police didn't have to look far for a suspect. Their son, Nick Reiner, 32, lived in the guest house just yards away from where their bodies were found. That night, he was arrested and later charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But this wasn't some random eruption of violence. According to friends, neighbors, even family, this was a tragedy in slow motion. Because the red flags weren't just waving, they were screaming. So the question is, how did it get to this point? Why did no one stop it? Why didn't Michelle, the mother, do more? Or maybe the more painful question is, did she know all along? And if she did, why did she stay silent? We're not just talking about hidden secrets. We're talking about a pattern. A cover-up. And a marriage built on quiet agreements and dangerous denial. Because just days before he died, Rob Reiner reportedly recorded a confession, not to police, not to a therapist, but to his closest advisor. In it, he doesn't just voice concern about Nick. He blames Michelle. Blames her for protecting their son long after she should have stepped back. Blames her for covering up violent outbursts, ignoring warnings, dismissing doctors. Blames her for the death they didn't see coming. But how do we know all this? Because it didn't stay hidden. Audio leaks, court documents, journal entries, insider testimony. Even their daughter, Romy Reiner, who reportedly discovered their bodies, pointed detectives toward one person with haunting words. There's someone in this family who scares me. You see, this isn't just a story about murder. This is a story about silence. It's about denial. It's about what happens when love becomes protection and protection becomes peril. But here's what might surprise you even more. Rob Reiner, the director of A Few Good Men, When Harry Met Sally, and Stand By Me, had been trying to send a message. And no one listened. Not until it was too late. Because beneath the Hollywood charm, the red carpet smiles, the liberal advocacy, and the decades-long marriage was a crumbling foundation. Cracks hidden behind perfectly rehearsed family photos and tight-lipped interviews. In public, Rob and Michelle were the model of Hollywood stability. But in private, he was terrified of what was happening under his own roof. You see, years ago, Rob started keeping notes. Journals. Audio recordings. Little breadcrumbs of pain and paranoia. A trail he hoped no one would ever need to follow. And yet, here we are. Those close to the family say the signs were all there. Rob had become withdrawn. Michelle had become defensive. And Nick had become erratic. Therapists warned them. Friends begged them. At least 2 insiders say that even Romy pleaded with her parents to do something before it was too late. But Michelle always had an answer. Nick's just struggling. He's been through a lot. We have it under control. She said those words so many times, even Rob started to believe them. Until he didn't. Until he saw his son screaming at staff, punching walls. Until he found out about an incident Michelle never told him about. One that involved a weapon. That was the final straw. In one of his final recordings, Rob said, "She kept it from me. She always does. I love her, but she's not protecting us anymore. She's protecting him. And I think it's going to end badly." He was right. But this story isn't just about blame. It's about why. Why would a mother protect her son so fiercely, even when it endangered everyone around her? Was it love? Was it guilt? Or was it something more? A family friend described Michelle as a fortress. Always smiling, always composed, never letting anything slip. But even fortresses crumble. And if you look close, really close, you'll see the fractures in her mask. Court records now suggest that Michelle had been warned multiple times by therapists, doctors, even legal advisors, to seek psychiatric care for Nick or remove him from the household. She didn't. In fact, she reportedly withdrew paperwork just hours before Rob tried to push for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. Why? Because Michelle believed her son would get better. She was convinced that if they loved him hard enough, protected him long enough, he'd come back. But sometimes, protecting someone means sacrificing everything else, including the truth. Now, here's where it gets even darker. Rob had begun reworking his will, reallocating assets, planning a possible separation. He didn't want to divorce her, but he wanted safety. For Romy, for the staff, and for himself. In his private journal, he wrote, "I don't know who I'm married to anymore. She looks like Michelle, sounds like Michelle, but she's not the same woman." And when friends pressed him about what that meant, he said, "You'll understand when the police come. We'll walk you through all of it. The therapy transcripts, the surveillance footage, the confessions, the secrets. We'll show you how a family collapsed, not overnight, but over years of silence and slow-boiling rage." And when you hear the final voicemail Romy left her father just days before the tragedy, your heart will break. Because she saw it coming, too. But what's coming next in this story? It's not what you expect. Because in our next chapter, we're taking you inside the crime scene itself. What the police found when they stepped into the Brentwood estate shocked even the most hardened investigators. The signs of struggle, the timeline, the weapon, but even more disturbing, a single piece of paper. Folded in Rob's shirt pocket. A note, a message, and its contents change everything. What would you do if your own home, the place you built with love, laughter, and legacy, became the scene of your last breath? That's exactly what happened on a cold Sunday evening in Brentwood. Not in some sketchy motel, not in a dangerous alleyway, but in the very heart of Rob and Michelle Reiner's palatial estate, behind locked gates, behind smiles, behind denial. The horror unfolded in silence. But the silence? It wasn't peace. It was pressure. It was years of tension, of buried outbursts, and unresolved trauma. And when it finally exploded, it left behind a scene that detectives would later call viscerally disturbing. So let's walk through it. Not to glorify it, but to understand what really happened and what was ignored until it was too late. December 14th, 7:42 p.m. The 911 call came from a woman's voice. Breathless, panicked, but controlled. "Something happened," she said. "You need to send someone quickly." The caller was Romy Reiner, their 27-year-old daughter. And she had just walked into something no child, no matter how old, should ever see. Her parents, lifeless, blood pooling into the corners of the master bedroom. A framed photo shattered on the floor. The door wide open. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No alarms triggered. Which meant one thing. Whoever did this was already inside. And according to initial reports, there were only 3 people on the property that day: Rob, Michelle, and their son, Nick. He had been living in the guest house, a structure Rob had built during Nick's second stint in rehab, supposedly to help him reintegrate without triggering tension in the main house. It was supposed to be a buffer. It became the base of operations. 8:01 p.m. LAPD arrives at the scene. Body cam footage, later leaked, shows officers stepping into the Reiner's Brentwood estate with flashlights drawn. Inside, it was eerily quiet. No signs of a break-in. No flickering lights. Nothing overturned downstairs. But as they reached the second floor, something shifted. Blood on the hallway carpet. Drag marks. Michelle Reiner's body was found near the bathroom door. Rob, just steps away, lying in a partially collapsed sitting chair, slumped at an angle. He'd been stabbed multiple times in the chest. Michelle. Stab wounds to the abdomen and neck. But here's the detail that stopped one of the officers cold. There were 2 wine glasses on the nightstand. Only one had fingerprints. That meant this wasn't just an ambush. This was deliberate. Someone was in conversation before the violence began. The murder weapon? Found in the kitchen sink. A large chef's knife, wiped but not cleaned. Residue still visible. Blood in the grooves of the handle. Fingerprints? One clear set. Nick's. But here's where it gets stranger. The guest house door? Locked from the inside. And when police pounded on it, they didn't hear panic. They heard, Nothing. Not a sound. Until suddenly, the door swung open, and there he was. Nick Reiner. Disheveled. Shirtless. Eyes glazed. Holding an electric guitar. When asked what happened, his answer: "They're sleeping." 3 words. No emotion. He didn't run. He didn't cry. He just walked back to his couch and sat down. Officers noted a faint smear of blood on his right hand. The arrest was immediate. Calm. Almost surreal. But if you're wondering whether this is where the horror ends, no. This is where it starts to unravel. Because when investigators began combing through the house, they weren't just looking for blood. They were looking for intention. They needed to know, was this premeditated? What triggered it? And, most importantly, was anyone covering up what led to this point? In Rob's shirt pocket, they found a folded letter. The handwriting matched his. It wasn't a suicide note. It wasn't even addressed to Michelle. It was written to his attorney. "If anything happens to me, I want this documented. I no longer believe Michelle is acting in the best interest of our safety. She is protecting Nick, and I fear it will cost us everything." That letter alone blew this case wide open. Because now it wasn't just about Nick. Now, there was a possible enabler. And that was Michelle. Let that sink in for a moment. Rob Reiner, a man with decades of Hollywood credibility, liberal activism, family loyalty, was scared in his own home. Scared of his son. And worse, he felt his wife wasn't protecting him. Let's pause right there. How many families hide dysfunction behind civility? How many people smile for the camera while breaking behind closed doors? This wasn't just a random tragedy. This was a domestic implosion, years in the making. And if you think that's dramatic, wait until you hear what Romy told detectives that night. According to a leaked officer's log, she reportedly said, "I tried to warn them. I told my mom something would happen, but she wouldn't listen." Romy had seen signs. Screaming in the hallway. Shattered dishes. Nick's erratic behavior. The time he punched a wall during Thanksgiving dinner. And every time she brought it up, Michelle defended him. Nick is healing. Nick is misunderstood. Nick would never hurt anyone. But he did. And now, her parents were gone. Here's another chilling detail. On a whiteboard in Nick's guest house, investigators found this phrase scrawled in red marker. "We begin again." Was it symbolic? Part of a script? A delusional mantra? Whatever it meant, it didn't bode well. Especially when paired with what they found on his laptop. A document titled, "Cleanse Sequence." It wasn't a screenplay. It was a step-by-step plan. The file described isolating toxicity from the home, erasing false legacies, starting over with only pure memory. Was Nick spiraling? Was this a mental break? Or was this revenge? Investigators brought in a forensic psychologist the next morning. Nick sat silently for most of the session. When asked if he understood why he was in custody, he said, "Because they stopped listening." That was it. But perhaps the most haunting moment of that session came when the psychologist asked, "Do you regret what happened?" Nick stared for 10 full seconds, then said, "It was necessary." Now ask yourself this. What happens in a family when warning signs are ignored? What happens when love crosses into denial? What happens when someone hides the truth to protect the one they love most, even if it puts everyone else in danger? That's what investigators are still trying to untangle. Because as clear as the fingerprints are, the motives are layered. So what did Michelle know? What had she been hiding? And why did she dismiss the warning signs that even Rob began documenting in secret? You're about to find out. Because in the next chapter, we'll dive into the one person who saw the horror unfold from the inside, yet stayed silent until it was too late. Romy Reiner, the daughter who found the bodies, the witness who knew the truth, and the woman who told police the most chilling sentence of the entire investigation. He said he'd do it, and now he has. But what else had Nick said? And why did no one listen? What Romy reveals next will leave you speechless. What if your own brother whispered something to you that you tried to forget? What if you told your mother, and she told you to just pray on it? And what if, years later, you walked into a room and realized that whisper had become a reality? That's the moment Romy Reiner faced on December 14th. And now, she isn't just a grieving daughter. She's the only surviving witness to a family's collapse. But here's the question no one is asking. Why wasn't anyone listening to Romy? Because long before the crime scene, long before the headlines, long before the world learned about Nick's arrest, Romy was waving red flags. And behind closed doors, she was screaming into a void. Let's rewind. Romy Reiner. Age, 27. Known in the public eye for her wit, her artistic edge, and a quiet creative life outside the shadow of her famous father. To outsiders, she seemed untouched by the Reiner legacy. Calm, clever, independent. But privately, she lived in fear. Not every day, but enough to remember where the panic buttons were in the house. Enough to memorize the exact creak of the guest house steps. Enough to keep a burner phone in her car just in case. And most disturbingly, she wrote it all down. Because Romy kept her own journal. That journal, now in LAPD custody, holds some of the most emotionally devastating entries in the entire case. In one entry, dated September 6th, he screamed again today. Same words. I'm the only real Reiner left. I told Mom. She said he's just spiraling and to stay out of it. She doesn't get it. Or maybe she doesn't want to. 2 weeks later, caught him watching something violent. He didn't know I was there. He was mouthing the words like it was a script. Scared the hell out of me. And just days before the murders, Mom pulled me aside, told me not to talk to Dad about Nick's episodes. Said it just upsets him. I asked her what happens if one day he doesn't just scream. She didn't answer. Let that sink in. Her journal wasn't full of dramatic ramblings. It was documentation, a breadcrumb trail of desperation. She wasn't imagining things. She was tracking them. And yet, she was dismissed. Over and over again. Because Romy wasn't just dealing with Nick. She was dealing with a family dynamic so toxic, so entrenched in shame and secrecy, that truth had no place in the room. So why didn't she go public? Why didn't she leave? That's where it gets complicated. Because Romy was caught between two extremes, a father increasingly paranoid and a mother obsessively protective, and a brother spiraling into something she didn't recognize. In private messages leaked from her old phone, Romy confides in a close friend. I think something terrible is going to happen here, and I don't know what to do. I love them all, but I think one of them is going to hurt the others. The friend replied, then get out. Romy's answer? I'm the only one who sees it all. If I leave, they won't have anyone left to warn them. Think about that. She stayed to protect her parents, even as she feared their silence might cost them their lives. Now here's the twist. Romy had gone to the police once before. October 2023. According to internal LAPD records, she filed what's called a soft report, meaning she didn't name a suspect, but expressed concern about a close family member whose behavior is escalating. She was advised to encourage her family to seek mental health intervention. She did, but Michelle dismissed it. Flat out. She reportedly told Rob that Romy was being dramatic, overly sensitive, and didn't understand how healing works. Rob, who was always deferential to Michelle on emotional matters, backed off. That was Romy's breaking point. In one final journal entry, written just 48 hours before the murders, Romy wrote, I'm watching a house burn down in slow motion. The worst part? They're holding hands inside it, smiling like it's a sunrise. And then, on Sunday night, she walked into that house and smelled smoke. Metaphorically, emotionally, and literally blood. Romy's 911 call, which has not been officially released but has been described by multiple sources, contains one of the most chilling opening lines in emergency response history. There's blood. A lot of it. I think my parents are, they're gone. But it's what she said after that, when officers arrived. That sent shivers down spines. He said he'd do it. And now he has. When asked who she meant, she answered without hesitation. Nick. My brother. And then she collapsed. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just crumpled. Witnesses say the officer had to hold her up as she went limp in his arms. Now, you might be wondering, why was Romy the one who found them? Why was she even at the house that night? That's where this gets even darker. Romy wasn't supposed to be there. She had moved out months prior. But Rob had called her earlier that day. According to phone records, they spoke at 2:34 p.m. for 6 minutes. What did they talk about? We don't know the whole conversation. But here's what's chilling. One line, captured in a voicemail transcript later leaked, reveals Rob's final message to Romy, left at 2:42 p.m. I need you to come by. I want you to have something. Just in case. He didn't say what. But when she got there, everything had already gone quiet. She rang the doorbell. No answer. She called her mother's phone. No answer. So she used the spare key, the one Rob had hidden under the side potted plant. And what she found inside broke her. Two lifeless bodies. Silence. And Nick, nowhere to be seen. Because by the time she reached the bedroom, Nick had already locked himself inside the guest house. And here's a detail no one talks about. Romy didn't immediately call 911. She sat on the stairs for 6 minutes. 6 whole minutes. She later told detectives she felt paralyzed, like she was in a movie she'd already seen in her head too many times. And when she did finally pick up the phone, it was already too late to save anyone, but not too late to tell the truth. Now, Romy's become the anchor of the case. The only family member willing to speak, really speak, about what went wrong. She's testified in pretrial hearings. She's handed over journals, emails, even voice notes. She's gone public in ways that risk exposing her family's darkest secrets. Why? Because, as she said in her first public statement, if telling the truth now prevents even one more tragedy like this, then I'll tell it. Again and again and again. But Romy's journey doesn't end there. Because what she hasn't shared publicly is the last message Nick ever sent her. A message he deleted from his phone, but not from hers. A message that, according to her, proves he knew exactly what he was doing. And in our next chapter, you'll finally hear what that message said. Because it wasn't just disturbing, it was strategic. And it reveals Nick Reiner's true mindset in the hours before the murders. He wasn't out of control. He was in complete control. What happens when the son of Hollywood royalty spirals, not in secret, but in full view of everyone who could have stopped him? And what if the people who should have helped decided instead to hide him? Nick Reiner was born into a legacy most kids can only dream of. The son of one of the most respected filmmakers in American cinema. Raised in privilege. Surrounded by stars. Protected by money, connections, and, most dangerously, unquestioned loyalty. But none of that could save him. And none of it could save his parents. Because behind the famous last name and the designer sunglasses was a young man with a storm brewing inside him. And that storm didn't come out of nowhere. Let's take it from the top. Nicholas Reiner. Born December 1991. By the time he was 12, he'd already been in therapy. Not because of tragedy or trauma, but because his parents noticed dark moods. That's how Michelle described it, according to leaked notes from a family therapist in 2003. But here's the twist. While Rob reportedly wanted full psychological evaluations, Michelle preferred a different route. Holistic treatments, spiritual cleanses, letting him express himself creatively. He was a writer, after all. Sensitive. Misunderstood. By age 15, Nick had already started experimenting with pills. Then it got worse. Rehab number 1, age 17. Quietly booked under an alias in an exclusive Malibu facility. No press coverage. No formal statement. Michelle told friends Nick was away at a writing retreat. Rob told no one. But Nick didn't stay clean. Within 6 months, he was found unconscious in the back seat of his own car, parked outside the Brentwood estate. This time, there was no hiding it. Rob exploded. According to a family friend who spoke anonymously, Rob considered sending Nick to a long-term psychiatric facility out of state. But Michelle blocked it. She said it would destroy him. So they compromised. Rehab number 2. Arizona. Nick went. He detoxed. He journaled. And then he came back. Only now, he wasn't living in the house anymore. Rob had quietly built a guest house. A detached structure near the pool, outfitted with its own entrance, smart locks, and surveillance. It was pitched as independence. In reality, it was a containment zone. But the walls of that guest house couldn't contain what was going on inside Nick's head. Because while he was there, he started writing again. Not scripts, not memoirs, but mantras. Here's one of the earliest ones, pulled from a document found on his iMac after the murders. I am the reset. I am the wound and the cure. The memory and the erasure. Disturbing? Sure. But it gets worse. Because those weren't just words. They were part of a growing pattern. His browser history revealed hours of research into family annihilation, psychotic breaks, and, most chillingly, how to fake a psychiatric relapse. Let that settle in. This wasn't chaos. It was calculation. But here's where the contradictions kick in. Because outside that guest house, Nick wasn't the monster. He was polite to staff. Quiet. Reserved. Sometimes even charming. A security guard described him as cordial, kind of distant, but never threatening. That's the danger of someone like Nick. You never see it coming. Until it's too late. But inside the family, It was a different story. Romy's journal entries describe late-night arguments. Nick screaming about being excluded, silenced, gaslight. He'd accuse Rob of emasculating him. Blamed Michelle for injecting fear. Blamed Romy for siding with the enemy. And yet, every time things escalated, Michelle stepped in. She'd smooth things over, minimize, deflect, redirect. One therapist noted in 2022, Mrs. Reiner presents as deeply protective of her son, to the point of interfering with clinical guidance. Interfering to protect, or to cover. Because around this time, Rob reportedly began keeping his own records. Private journals, voicemails to himself, emails to his lawyer, marked confidential. In one email, dated July 2024, Rob wrote, "Nick is a fuse. I'm watching the wire shrink daily. Michelle thinks love will defuse it. I don't think that's how this ends." He wasn't wrong. And here's where it starts boiling over. October 2024. Nick allegedly threw a chair through a window. Not at a party. Not during a relapse. Just rage. Triggered by a minor disagreement about holiday plans. Michelle paid for the repairs in cash. Told staff it was an accident. Rob, meanwhile, documented it in a folder titled, Guest House Incidents. There were 14 entries. From slamming doors to violent shouting. From destroyed art to stolen medication. And yet, no police reports were filed. Why? Because Michelle stopped him. Every time Rob suggested intervention, Michelle argued. Every time Romy begged for action, Michelle soothed. And every time Nick erupted, Michelle forgave. But then came December 12th, 2 days before the murders. Rob scheduled a meeting with a private security firm. He was preparing to move forward with a restraining order. The documents were found half-completed in his office drawer. Signed, but not submitted. According to Rob's lawyer, Rob called him that same night and said, "I don't know if I'll get another chance. If something happens, hold Michelle accountable too. She's not seeing clearly anymore." That was the last conversation they had. 2 days later, he was gone. But let's rewind again. Just once more. Because there's one message we haven't talked about yet. Nick's final text to Romy. Sent at 6:08 p.m., just over an hour before police believe the murders occurred. It read, "He's not going to erase me. I'm going to finish the script." Chilling? It gets worse. Because the next line said, "And when it's done, you'll understand." To this day, Romy has refused to say what she thinks that meant. But we know this. Nick's laptop held dozens of drafts. Stories of the forgotten son. Of lies behind walls. Of removal as rebirth. He wasn't just spiraling. He was writing a climax. And in his twisted mind, murder was the resolution. But what made him snap? What moment pushed him over? What triggered the final act? That's what investigators are still piecing together. Because in the next chapter, we're going to open a file no one was supposed to see. Rob Reiner's secret journals. Hidden, protected, and filled with confessions. In them, Rob lays out exactly when he realized Michelle was hiding something. Exactly when he stopped trusting her. And exactly why he thought she would get them killed. How do you scream for help when everyone thinks you're the strong one? That's the impossible question Rob Reiner lived with in his final years. He wasn't just a director. He wasn't just a father. He wasn't just Michelle's husband. He was a man trying to hold his family together with fraying thread, and he was losing his grip. So what did he do? He started writing. But not screenplays. Not op-eds. Not Hollywood memoirs. He kept a secret set of diaries. Private. Unpublished. Hidden in a locked drawer in his office. Away from the cameras, the critics, and the chaos. To the public, Rob Reiner was a confident liberal lion. A silver-haired, outspoken advocate of justice. But in those pages, he was terrified. Let's start at the beginning. The earliest entry investigators recovered was dated May 9, 2016. That was just weeks after Nick returned from his second rehab stay. Here's the entry. Michelle is trying to believe this is a clean slate. I want to believe it too. But Nick's eyes are different. Cold. Sharp. Watching everything. Already, you can feel the shift. Rob wasn't just hopeful. He was suspicious. And that suspicion only grew. June 21st, 2016. Nick shouted at her again tonight. Over nothing. Something about the air conditioning being rigged. She said he's tired. I think he's sick. These were not overreactions. These were observations. He was documenting what he saw because he knew, deep down, he might need to prove it someday. and it wasn't long before his notes turned darker. August 2nd, 2017. Tried to talk to Michelle about the outbursts. She got quiet. Said he needs us right now. I asked at what cost. She didn't answer. There's that phrase again. At what cost? Rob repeated that line 9 times in his journals over the years. That wasn't random. It was refrain. A man haunted by a simple truth. He loved his son, but feared him. And he loved his wife, but no longer trusted her. Because here's where it gets twisted. Rob's entries show he began to suspect Michelle wasn't just in denial. She was covering up. November 5th, 2018. Found shards of glass in the backyard. Asked Michelle. She said Nick dropped a water bottle. But staff later told me it was a wine glass he threw at the dog. Why lie? January 13th, 2019. Michelle canceled the psych eval. She didn't tell me until days later. Said it would set him off. I said, isn't he already off? She got defensive. Each entry paints a picture of a man slowly realizing he's the only one in the room telling the truth. And the more he pressed, the more Michelle pushed back. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't threatening. She was simply refusing. Refusing to acknowledge the escalation. Refusing to see Nick's behavior as dangerous. Refusing to believe her son could hurt anyone. But Rob? He was done pretending. April 2nd, 2020. Romy came to me crying. Said she doesn't feel safe in the house. Michelle told her she's being dramatic. I told Romy she's not. I'm failing her. I know it. This was no longer just about Nick. It was about Romy. It was about Rob's own sense of failure, his growing horror that, in protecting one child, Michelle was endangering the other. And herself. And him. July 16th, 2021. He punched a wall today, right through the drywall. I asked Michelle if we could call someone. She said it's just anger. I said, it's just a warning. She walked away. Let's pause right here. Have you ever known someone so deep in denial, they mistake the sound of fire for a lullaby? That was Michelle. According to Rob, she was so afraid of breaking Nick that she let him break everything else. But Rob wasn't a fool. He knew he was getting older, slower, more fragile, and that's when the paranoia set in. October 4th, 2022. He stood too close today. I was in the kitchen. He said nothing, just stared. I asked what was wrong. He smiled. That's all. I haven't slept well since. He began locking his door at night. He began recording arguments on his phone. And he began planning his exit strategy. In several entries, Rob talks about rewriting his will. Not to cut Nick out entirely. He couldn't bring himself to do that. But to protect Romy. To shift assets. To make sure the legacy doesn't fall into the wrong hands. One entry reads, I've spent my life building a name, but I'm starting to think that name might end with a scandal. Or worse, a bloodbath. God, I hope I'm wrong. But Rob wasn't wrong. And as the entries get closer to the date of the murders, they get even more frantic. November 27th, 2024. He left a note in my office. Just a single line. You don't get to win. Michelle says I'm imagining things. I'm not. I know his handwriting. I know his tone. December 9th, 2024. Romy called me tonight. She's scared. I told her to come home. She said she doesn't want to. I didn't beg. I should have. December 13th, 2024. I told Michelle, he's going to hurt someone. She said, don't say things like that. I said, you don't say them. That's the problem. And then, the final entry. December 14th, 2024. I've drafted the letter to Eric, his attorney. I don't know if it's paranoia or prophecy, but if anything happens to me, this is the record. Michelle is no longer objective. She's blind, and I don't know how long we have. That was the last time he picked up the pen. Just hours later, he was dead. So what does this all mean? It means Rob Reiner saw the train coming. He blew the whistle. He screamed into the void. But Michelle never heard him. Or worse, chose not to. And now the question shifts. From Rob's fear to Michelle's role. Because up until this point, you might have seen her as a loving mother. A woman caught between two fires. A victim of circumstance. But what if she wasn't? What if Michelle Reiner, sweet, soft-spoken, respected, actively prevented intervention? What if her love became a weapon? And what if that weapon was silence? In the next chapter, we dive into Michelle's side of the story. Her emails, her text messages, her choices. We'll explore why she stood by Nick, even as her husband and daughter begged her to see the danger. We'll reveal the last email she sent, just 48 hours before she died. And what it said might be the most chilling revelation yet. What if the greatest danger to your family wasn't the chaos, but the calm that kept covering it up? Michelle Reiner was the quiet one, always poised, always composed, never the center of attention, but always in control. To the world, she was the perfect partner to Rob Reiner. Supportive, loving, fiercely loyal. The woman behind the man. But behind that woman was another version. One who had spent years keeping secrets. One who saw the signs, read the warnings, felt the fear, but chose, again and again, to shield her son. So today, we're pulling back that veil. Because Michelle's love may have been pure, but her denial? It was deadly. Let's start here. Michelle's phone, recovered by detectives hours after her death. Smashed screen. Unlocked. It held over 200 unread text messages. But among the messages she did read were multiple from Rob and Romy, each one more desperate than the last. But her responses? Measured, short, deflective. Take this one from October 3rd, 2024. Romy texts, "Mom, he was screaming again. It's not okay. Why are you pretending it is?" Michelle responds, "He's had a rough day. He didn't mean anything by it. Let's not label him." 2 days later, Rob texts, "We need to talk. I'm starting to feel unsafe in this house." Michelle replies, "You're exhausted. Let's sleep on it and revisit later." That word, revisit, keeps showing up. In texts, emails, voice notes. Michelle's response to every red flag wasn't panic. It was postponement. But why? Why would a smart, rational woman refuse to take action when her husband and daughter were begging her to? Let's go back a bit to Michelle's early motherhood. According to interviews with former family friends, Michelle always saw Nick as fragile. He was a sensitive boy, prone to isolation, anxiety, tantrums. And while Rob leaned toward professional help, Michelle leaned into protection. She'd cancel therapy appointments, tell teachers that Nick was just processing the world differently. When he started acting out in high school, she blamed the school. When he was suspended for violence, she called it exaggerated discipline. One friend recalls, "Michelle had this warm smile, but behind it was steel. If you criticized Nick, you lost access." She cut people out. Fast. This was a pattern. And it didn't stop when Nick became an adult. In fact, it intensified. After Nick's second rehab stint, Rob suggested an in-home counselor, a live-in specialist. Michelle rejected it flat out. Her reasoning? "We're not a clinic. We're a family." But were they? Or were they hostages to her hope? Because by 2021, things were already unraveling. Romy moved out. Rob started journaling. Nick isolated further. And Michelle kept smiling. But here's where the story twists again. Because Michelle wasn't just ignoring red flags. She was removing them. According to a former staff member, who has since submitted a formal statement to investigators, Michelle once deleted a recording from the home surveillance system. It allegedly captured Nick slamming a door and shouting threats. Michelle called the security manager the next morning and requested that the accidental footage be wiped. She said it was too upsetting to keep on file. And that wasn't the only time. Emails now show she intercepted at least 3 attempts by Rob to set up psychiatric evaluations. Each time, she canceled them, claiming scheduling conflicts or travel obligations. But here's the most damning part. December 12th, 2024, 2 days before the murders, Michelle sends an email to a family friend, a therapist who had treated Nick in the past. Here's what it said. "He's gotten louder, angrier, but I don't think it's permanent. I still believe in him. I have to. Otherwise, what was all of this for?" Let that land. Otherwise, what was all of this for? That line tells you everything. Michelle wasn't just defending Nick. She was defending her investment. Her belief that she could love him back to normal. That if she just held on long enough, stayed patient long enough, fought everyone off long enough, he'd come back to her. But the deeper truth? He was never coming back. Because Nick hadn't improved. He'd adapted. He'd learned how to manipulate the one person who refused to see him clearly. And Michelle? She had enabled him to perfection. Even when Rob begged her to wake up, even when Romy begged her to run, Michelle stood firm. Because in her eyes, to admit danger was to admit defeat. And she wasn't going to lose her son. But in the process, she lost everything else. Now here's where the heartbreak cuts deepest. In her final sent message, Michelle texted Rob at 6:31 p.m., just hours before their time of death. "Let's talk after dinner. I know it's getting worse, but I still believe we can fix this." Rob never replied. Because by then, it was already too late. Nick was in the house. Dinner never happened. And Michelle's belief, her faith, turned fatal. Now, some may say she was just a mother doing what mothers do, protecting her child, refusing to abandon him. But others? They see something else. They see a mother who silenced the alarm bells, who saw the floodwaters rise and chose to stay inside the house. And by the time she reached for a lifeline, there was none left. Here's something Romy told investigators after reading her mother's last message. She didn't deserve what happened, but she made choices. And one of those choices was ignoring me. Let that sink in. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just mental illness. This was compounded failure. A family imploding under the weight of one person's refusal to acknowledge reality. And now, Michelle is gone. Rob is gone. Nick is behind bars. And Romy is the last one left holding the broken pieces. But we're not done. Because while Michelle was burying truth, Rob was preparing evidence. Audio, notes, even a voice memo that, until now, hasn't been made public. In the next chapter, we'll play that tape. And what Rob says in those final private moments. It doesn't just expose Michelle's choices. It changes everything. What happens when a family sits in the same room, but no one is really saying what they feel? They smile. They nod. They listen. But underneath the surface, they're drowning in secrets. That was the Reiners in therapy. Not once, not twice, but dozens of sessions, over the span of nearly 6 years. And yet, none of it was enough. Because the truth wasn't in what they said out loud. The truth was in what they refused to say. And in the end, those unsaid words were louder than any outburst. Let's open the file. The Reiner family began therapy together in 2018. At first, it was casual, a way to process the transition as Nick returned from rehab. But it didn't stay casual. By 2020, sessions were mandatory, scheduled weekly, often with rotating therapists. Some sessions included Rob, Michelle, and Nick. Others included Romy. But one thing was consistent. Nothing ever stayed solved. Let's walk through what the therapy files reveal, because thanks to a court-ordered subpoena, transcripts, notes, and therapist memos are now in the hands of investigators. And what's inside? It's shocking. Let's begin with one of the earliest notes from Dr. Leah Harmon, the family's first group counselor. Family dynamic is tense. Father exhibits signs of repressed fear masked by sarcasm. Mother is overly accommodating to the son's narrative. Son shows signs of paranoia, passive aggression, and emotional volatility. That was from session number 2. It only got worse. Session number 5, 2019, Rob Reiner says, "I don't feel like I'm allowed to say what I really think anymore." Michelle responds, "You're allowed. You just always make things sound worse than they are." Nick? He sits in silence. Session number 7. Romy joins. She cries mid-session, says she feels like the referee in a boxing match where no one follows the rules. Nick rolls his eyes. Michelle tells the therapist, "Romy has always been emotional." Rob goes quiet. "Let's pause here. Did you catch that?" Romy opens up. Michelle invalidates. And Rob shuts down. That triangle of behavior plays out over and over in these files. Now here's where it gets disturbing. Session number 13, 2020. Nick tells the therapist, "Sometimes I feel like this isn't my family. Like they're playing a role and waiting for me to mess it up." Rob responds, "No one wants you to mess up. We want you to be okay." Nick stares, then says, "Define okay." Michelle interrupts. She says, "He just needs time. He's still healing." But the therapist notes something chilling here. Nick appears detached. Language suggests dissociation. When pressed on empathy, deflects or grows combative. Combative? You haven't heard anything yet. Because in session number 19, the tone takes a turn. Nick lashes out, verbally. "You think I'm the problem? You're all fake." Romy plays the victim. Dad plays the martyr. Mom just keeps smiling like nothing's happening. "At least I'm real." Michelle's response, "You're allowed to feel that way." The therapist's note? Concerning dynamic. Mother continues to validate toxic language to maintain calm. Other family members show visible distress. Risk of codependency enabling emotional abuse. That's the clinical version. But in plain English, Michelle was making it worse. She wasn't helping. She was protecting, shielding. And every time Rob or Romy tried to express fear, she shut it down with a smile. Now let's look at session number 23, 2021. One of the most heartbreaking moments. Romy says, "I don't want to be in the house alone with him anymore." Nick snaps back. "Then don't. No one's begging you." Michelle tells the therapist, "They just need space." The therapist gently asks Rob if he feels safe. He hesitates, then says, "I love my son, but I don't know who he is anymore." Michelle interjects again. "He's the same person. He's just hurting." The therapist pauses, then writes in her notes, "Mother's persistent denial and defensive positioning is impairing the family's ability to heal or protect themselves." Now ask yourself, what do you do when the therapist becomes afraid? Because that's what happens next. In session number 27, Dr. Harmon recommends a 90-day family separation. She says Nick needs inpatient care, that his anger is escalating, that boundaries must be enforced. Rob agrees. Romy nods. But Michelle flatly refuses. It'll break him. He's fragile. The session ends early. That was the last time Dr. Harmon met with the family. She resigned the following week. Her final note? "My professional opinion is that the current family structure is not only dysfunctional, it's actively dangerous." Let that sink in. Actively dangerous. From a licensed clinical psychologist. But it didn't stop there. They tried 2 more therapists. The same pattern unfolded. Rob pleading, Romy unraveling, Nick spiraling, Michelle smiling. One therapist called her a crisis diffuser turned crisis delayer. Another described her as the ultimate peacemaker who doesn't believe the war is real. But the war was real, and it was inside their home. And in their final session, session number 33, just 2 months before the murders, Nick says something that would later send shivers down investigators' spines. When asked what he wants from his family, he says, "I want silence." The therapist asks, "What do you mean by that?" Nick replies, "I want them to stop pretending. Stop talking. Stop existing like I don't see everything." Rob's face, according to the transcript, went pale. Michelle put her hand on Nick's arm and said, "We hear you." Did they? Did she? Because that moment, those words, haunt Romy to this day. Because 2 months later, there was silence. And what Nick said came true. Now here's the final twist in this chapter. In Rob's journal, found tucked beside a session printout, he had written a single line in the margin. "Therapy doesn't work when one person's lying and the other person won't admit it." So what was the lie? What was Michelle protecting? What did Rob see that made him start recording conversations secretly? And most haunting of all, what did Rob say when he thought no one else was listening? Because in the next chapter, you'll hear it. The leaked confession tape. Rob, alone, late at night, speaking into a recorder. And in that recording, he says something no one saw coming. Not about Nick. Not even about Michelle, but about himself. What he believed he'd done. What he believed he'd allowed. And why? Just days before he died, he said, "I think I created the monster." What do you see when you look at a red carpet photo? Smiles? Glamour? Perfection? What you don't see are the cracks, the quiet stares, the tense hands just out of frame, the pain behind the performance. Because in Hollywood, image is everything. And the Reiner family knew how to play the part. They smiled. They posed. They gave interviews about love, legacy, and sticking together through everything. But what they never said was that everything was falling apart. This chapter isn't about the murder. This chapter is about the mask. The image the Reiners presented to the world while their private lives were quietly collapsing behind the scenes. Let's pull back the curtain. The illusion began early. Rob Reiner wasn't just a director. He was America's dad. From All in the Family to When Harry Met Sally, he built his reputation on feel-good stories, moral clarity, and emotional intelligence. Off camera, he was the same, or so he thought. He married Michelle in the late 80s, and for decades, they were a golden couple. Never divorced. No cheating scandals. No tabloid blow-ups. Just peace. Or so it seemed. Because what no one knew was that while Rob projected confidence and control, Michelle was the real architect of the illusion. She kept the house quiet. She managed the family calendar. She responded to interview requests. And when Nick's issues began surfacing in the mid-2000s, she handled that too. Quietly, discreetly, with absolute control. Whenever Nick disappeared for a few months, Michelle would say, "He's working on a project." When friends asked about Romy's abrupt move out in 2021, she'd say, "She just wants her independence." And when Rob started withdrawing from the public eye in 2023, just focusing on family, Michelle told the press. But behind closed doors, there was chaos. Let's look at 3 specific public moments that, in hindsight, were hiding something much darker. 1. The 2022 Hollywood Legacy Gala. Rob and Michelle appear arm in arm. Nick, shockingly, joins them on stage for a rare family appearance. The audience claps. Michelle gives a speech. Family is the root of everything. It's what grounds us and reminds us who we really are. That same night, according to Romy's text messages, Nick had a violent breakdown backstage after Michelle refused to let him speak. Romy texted a friend. He punched a mirror. Security had to step in. And Mom still said he just needed a moment. Michelle handled it. The media never knew. The illusion stayed intact. 2. Rob's 75th birthday post. Shared on Instagram. A family photo, Rob, Michelle, Nick, and Romy, smiling around a dinner table. The caption reads, "Grateful for every chapter." But if you zoom in, Romy isn't smiling. In fact, sources say that photo was taken under pressure. Romy had refused to join until Rob personally called her. She showed up, took the photo, left 10 minutes later. Why? Because 2 days earlier, Nick had threatened her. And Michelle told her not to make it a thing. The post went viral. Millions liked it. No one saw the truth. 3. Michelle's interview with a wellness podcast. In early 2024, Michelle sat down for a now-haunting interview. When asked how she manages stress, she said, "I remind myself that every storm is just a passing weather pattern, and I keep my umbrella ready." The host laughed. Michelle smiled. What she didn't say was that the storm she was referring to was her son, and her umbrella was denial. Now here's the deeper question. Why keep pretending? Why maintain the illusion so aggressively when things were clearly unraveling? Because in Hollywood, image isn't just reputation, it's currency. Rob and Michelle had built a brand, a legacy. They were symbols of stability, and admitting their son was a threat would shatter everything. But it wasn't just about public perception. It was about internal denial. Because if they admitted the truth out loud, to the world, it meant facing it at home. It meant facing the years of excuses, the broken plates, the broken trust, and worst of all, it meant answering questions. Questions they didn't want to answer. Like, why did you ignore the warnings? Why did you silence your daughter? Why did you protect him, even when it endangered everyone else? So instead, they performed. They gave interviews. They posted throwbacks. And all the while, the house got quieter. The smiles got tighter. And Nick? He got more isolated, more angry, more detached. But no one saw that, because no one wanted to. Now let's talk about Romy. While her parents played the part, Romy opted out. She stopped appearing in family photos. She skipped events. She started posting cryptic quotes on Instagram. One of her most shared posts, just a month before the murders, read, "You can only fake peace for so long before the war finds you again." Friends asked what she meant. She wouldn't say. But now, we know. Because while her parents wore the mask, Romy had taken hers off. She was the only one willing to say, "This isn't normal." She was the only one who saw the illusion and called it what it was, a lie. There's one more detail you need to hear. A former Reiner family publicist came forward anonymously after the murders. Here's what they said. "My job wasn't just to get Rob in the news. It was to keep Nick out of it. There were breakdowns. There were incidents. I was told to spin everything." Michelle ran point. Spin everything, even as her family spun out of control. So now we ask, was Michelle protecting her family or preserving the fantasy? Was Rob trying to keep the peace or avoid public shame? And how far would someone go to avoid letting the illusion shatter? Because in the end, it did. The mask cracked. And when it did, the truth came pouring out. But we're not done. Because hidden behind the photos, behind the staged dinners, behind the carefully worded interviews, was something else. A tape. A private confession. Rob Reiner, alone, recording his final thoughts. And in that tape, he doesn't just reveal what he feared. He reveals what he believed he caused. In the next chapter, we'll play the words the world wasn't supposed to hear. And when you hear them, you'll never look at Rob Reiner the same way again. What do you say when you know the end is near and no one around you is truly listening? Not your wife, not your son, not even the daughter who loves you, but is just as afraid as you are. What if your last act wasn't calling the police, but turning on a recorder? Because maybe, just maybe, your voice would last longer than your body. That's what Rob Reiner did. He left behind a tape, a voice memo, recovered from his phone after his death. It wasn't labeled confession. It wasn't filed in any special folder. It wasn't time-stamped in red. But when investigators opened it, they realized it was everything. A man's final thoughts, final truths, and a final heartbreak. The recording is 14 minutes and 23 seconds long, but the damage it leaves is permanent. Let's walk through it together, because in this chapter, we're going to hear Rob Reiner's real voice, not the one he used on television. Not the man in the tailored suit smiling for charity events, but the man who sat alone in a room, speaking into a void. A man unraveling, a man afraid, but also a man taking responsibility. Minute midnight to 0:45. The audio begins softly. You hear the sound of a glass clinking, maybe whiskey, a creaking chair. Silence. Then, Rob speaks. His voice is raspy, measured, tired. If anyone's listening to this, I guess something's gone wrong. Or maybe right. Who knows anymore? Already, there's a sense of resignation. Not anger, not panic, just quiet grief. He takes a breath. You hear it shake. Then he continues. I'm recording this because I don't think I'll be able to say it out loud. Not to Michelle, not to Nick, not to Romy, especially not to Romy. Minute 0:46 to 2:10. He reflects on Michelle. She thinks she's doing the right thing. She always has. I don't think she's evil. I don't even think she's delusional. I think she's just terrified of what she already knows. He pauses. She won't admit it. That he's dangerous. That this house is broken. That the son we raised isn't coming back. He clears his throat. But here's the truth. I let this happen too. I didn't push hard enough. I didn't stop it when I had the chance. He sighs again. Then this. I've spent my life telling stories. And I couldn't even tell the truth in my own house. That line hits like a gut punch. Because you realize. This isn't just a confession. It's an apology. Minute 2:11 to 4:50. He talks about Nick. I don't know when it changed. He was always intense. But somewhere along the way he switched. Like something dark took over. And it stayed. We thought love could fix it. We thought if we hugged him hard enough, he'd come back. He didn't. He got smarter. More manipulative. He learned what to say to calm us. Then he'd explode all over again. He laughs, but it's bitter. I built a guest house to keep my son from destroying the rest of us. How messed up is that? And I still called it love. Minute 4:51 to 6:45. Then he talks about Romy. And you can hear the break in his voice. She's the only one who sees clearly. And we punished her for it. Called her dramatic. Told her to relax. She was never the problem. She's the only reason we're still standing. Or were. She told me last week she doesn't want to visit anymore. Said she's tired of pretending. Another pause. Longer this time. I don't blame her. Minute 6:46 to 8:30. He turns inward. And then comes the line that stuns the entire room of detectives listening to the playback. I think I created the monster. Not with cruelty. Not with abuse. But with passivity. With permission. I let Michelle take over because it was easier. I stayed quiet because I was tired. And when I finally spoke up, it was too late. That's when the tape begins to tremble. Not physically, but emotionally. Because the mask is off now. And what's underneath is pure guilt. Minute 8:31 to 10 o'clock. Then comes a memory. Nick once told me he felt invisible. That no one really saw him. I laughed. Told him we were all watching. But I don't think I ever really looked at him. Not honestly. Because if I had, I might have seen what was coming. His voice cracks. I might have stopped it. Minute 10:01 to 12:20. Rob's tone shifts. He's preparing to say goodbye. If I don't make it, if you're hearing this, please don't hate Michelle. She loved too much. That was her crime. And Nick? I don't know what's left in him. But I hope there's a part that still remembers who he used to be. Then to Romy. And here's the part that left everyone in the room stunned. Romy, I'm sorry. I see you now. I hear you. You were right. And I hope you get far away from here. Far enough to start over. You didn't deserve any of this. You were the best of us. Then silence. Nothing but static for 20 seconds. Minute 12:21, end. The last thing Rob says? It's quiet. Barely a whisper. But it hits like a scream. I'm not scared of death. I'm scared of what I left behind. Then the click. The tape ends. Let's stop for a moment. Let it all sink in. Because this wasn't just a confession. This was a reckoning. Rob wasn't blaming anyone else. Not really. He was blaming himself. For waiting too long. For loving too softly. For choosing silence when he should have raised hell. And yet, even in the final minutes, he's trying to protect the very people who ignored him. That's who Rob was. But here's the twist. This recording? It almost never surfaced. Because it was buried in his phone. Not labeled. Not filed. Just a forgotten file called audio test_15. Investigators almost skipped it. But Romy insisted on going through everything. And when she heard it, she collapsed. She told police. That's the dad I remember. Not the performer. Not the peacemaker. The truth teller. Even if it came too late. So now we ask, what if he had shared that tape earlier? What if he had played it for Michelle? For Romy? For Nick? Would anything have changed? Or was this story always destined to end in blood? In the next chapter, we'll return to where it all began. The house. The crime scene. The $13.5 million home that Rob once called my final sanctuary. We'll walk through its blueprint. Its secrets. And the motion sensor trigger at exactly 3:17 a.m. That captured the moment everything changed.